On March 10th, 2023, in a heavily guarded conference room in Beijing, two men sat across from each other and signed a document that shocked the world. One represented the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The other represented the Islamic Republic of Iran. For 7 years, these two nations had not spoken officially. Their embassies had been closed, their diplomats had been expelled, their proxy forces had been killing each other across Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And yet here they were, shaking hands under Chinese mediation, agreeing to restore full diplomatic relations within 2 months. The headline that day said historic breakthrough. But the real question, the question that every intelligence analyst, every regional government, and every oil market trader immediately asked was simple. Is this real or is it theater? Because Saudi Arabia and Iran have been locked in the most consequential power struggle in the modern Middle East for decades. Their rivalry has fueled wars, destabilized governments, sent oil prices soaring, and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. A single handshake in Beijing cannot undo all of that. Or can it? 3 years after that signing, the answer is still being written. And what has happened since March 2023 reveals something far more complex than either a triumphant peace or a cynical performance. It reveals two countries that genuinely need each other, genuinely distrust each other, and are slowly, painfully, imperfectly trying to figure out whether the Middle East power struggle can be managed without destroying everything both sides have built. In the next few minutes, you're going to understand exactly how this diplomatic breakthrough happened, what it has actually achieved, what still stands between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and whether this fragile détente can survive the pressures now bearing down on it from every direction. To understand the breakthrough, you have to understand the depth of the rupture it was trying to repair. Saudi Arabia and Iran are not natural enemies. They are both Muslim-majority nations. They share a region, shared history, and share an interest in stable oil markets. But they represent two competing visions of what the Middle East should look like. Saudi Arabia is a Sunni monarchy, the custodian of Islam's two holiest sites in Mecca and Medina, a close security partner of the United States, and the anchor of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Iran is a Shia theocracy, led by a supreme leader who sees the export of its Islamic revolution as a religious obligation, a determined adversary of American influence in the region, and the primary sponsor of armed proxy groups across 4 countries. These two visions cannot easily coexist. When Iran's revolution succeeded in 1979, Saudi Arabia watched with alarm as Ayatollah Khomeini declared that monarchies were un-Islamic and called on Shia Muslims across the Gulf to rise up. When Iranian pilgrims organized political demonstrations during the 1987 Hajj in Mecca, Saudi security forces responded with force, and over 400 people died, including many Iranians. Tehran cut diplomatic ties. When Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in 1980, Saudi Arabia funded Iraq, not because it loved Saddam, but because it feared Iran more. When Saddam was toppled in 2003 and Iran's influence flooded into the Iraqi power vacuum, Saudi Arabia watched its nightmare materialize. Iran now had armed proxies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. It had ballistic missiles that could reach Riyadh. And in 2019, those missiles and drones were used in a devastating attack on Saudi Aramco's oil processing facility at Abqaiq, cutting Saudi oil production in half in a single night. The world's energy markets shook. The attack was never officially claimed by Iran, but American and Saudi intelligence concluded Tehran was responsible. That was the context in which the Beijing deal was signed. Not a clean slate, not a fresh start between friendly neighbors. A grudging, strategic, calculated decision by two adversaries that, continuing to fight, was costing them both too much. What drove Saudi Arabia to the table? The answer is Vision 2030. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia since 2017, has staked his legacy on transforming the Saudi economy from oil dependence to a diversified powerhouse of tourism, technology, entertainment, and investment. That project requires stability. It requires foreign investment. It requires that Riyadh not be a target for Iranian missiles and Houthi drones. The Yemen war, which Saudi Arabia entered in 2015 to push back Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, had by 2023 cost Riyadh an estimated $100 billion with no decisive outcome. Saudi cities had been hit by hundreds of drone and missile attacks. The economic cost was enormous, but more damaging was the reputational cost. Investors looking at Saudi Arabia saw a country at war, a country whose critical infrastructure could be struck at any time. That was incompatible with Vision 2030's goals. MBS needed the war to end, and the war could not end without some understanding with Tehran. What drove Iran to the table? The answer is economic survival. By 2023, Iran was facing crushing American sanctions. Its currency had collapsed. Inflation was running above 40%. Unemployment among young Iranians was devastating. The regime had just violently suppressed the woman life freedom protests that erupted after the death of Mahsa Amini in September 2022. It needed relief. It needed to demonstrate that it was not completely isolated. And a deal with Saudi Arabia, brokered by China, sent several messages simultaneously. It told the Arab world that Iran was not a pariah. It told Beijing that Tehran was a valuable diplomatic partner. And it told Washington that Iran had options beyond the American-led order. China's role deserves special attention because it changed the diplomatic architecture of the Middle East in a way that is still unfolding. For decades, the United States had positioned itself as the indispensable power in the Gulf, the guarantor of Saudi security, the protector of Gulf oil flows, the mediator of regional disputes. The Beijing deal announced something different. China, which imports more oil from both Saudi Arabia and Iran than any other country, had strong economic incentives to reduce tensions between its two major suppliers. Beijing's mediation was not driven by ideology or values. It was driven by oil, by trade, and by the strategic opportunity to demonstrate that China could do what America had failed to do, bring regional rivals to the same table. The deal was a signal to the entire Middle East. America is not the only power that can shape your region. China is here, and China can deliver. For Saudi Arabia, this was not about replacing the United States as a security partner. Riyadh still buys American weapons, hosts American military assets, and relies on American security guarantees for its survival. But the Beijing deal gave MBS leverage. It showed Washington that Saudi Arabia had options, and it showed Saudi Arabia's own population that their leadership was sophisticated enough to play multiple great powers against each other. The 18 months following March 2023 were not a triumphant peace. They were a careful, halting, often frustrating process of incremental normalization. Both countries named ambassadors, embassies reopened, senior officials exchanged visits. In April 2024, Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei received a letter from Saudi King Salman, a gesture of personal diplomacy that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. Saudi Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman, the brother of MBS, visited Tehran and met directly with Khamenei. Iranian and Saudi naval forces participated in joint exercises in the Sea of Oman in October 2024. The Saudi Chief of General Staff traveled to Tehran in November 2024 for direct military-to-military talks. These were not symbolic gestures. Military-to-military engagement between Saudi Arabia and Iran had essentially never happened in the modern era. The fact that it was now occurring, however tentatively, represented a genuine structural shift. On the economic side, progress was slower. Iran's non-oil exports to Saudi Arabia reached $12.5 billion in 2025, a significant increase from near zero. Direct flights between Mashhad and Dammam resumed in December 2024 after a 9-year suspension, creating new channels for religious tourism and business travel. A joint Saudi-Iranian Chamber of Commerce was announced, though implementation remained slow. The two countries established joint committees to review and implement agreements, meeting in Beijing in trilateral sessions that included China as a guarantor. But full economic normalization faced a fundamental obstacle. Iran remained under severe American sanctions. Any Saudi company doing significant business with Iran risked secondary sanctions from Washington. The economic relationship could grow at the margins, but it could not transform while that sanctions regime remained in place. The most immediate test of the diplomatic breakthrough was Yemen. The Houthi movement, which controls most of northern Yemen, including the capital Sana'a, receives Iranian weapons, training, and strategic direction. Saudi Arabia has been at war with the Houthis since 2015, suffering enormous military and economic costs. For the Saudi-Iran deal to produce real results, it needed to change the Yemen equation. And here, the picture is complicated. Iran did reduce some of its direct military support to the Houthis following the Beijing deal. The pace of Houthi attacks on Saudi territory decreased in 2023 and 2024 compared to the intense campaigns of earlier years. UN-led peace negotiations resumed. Saudi Arabia and the Houthi leadership held direct talks for the first time. But Iran never fully controlled the Houthis and never fully stopped supporting them. When the Gaza war erupted in October 2023, the Houthis launched an independent campaign against shipping in the Red Sea and against Israel, which drew American and British military strikes on Houthi positions. This created enormous complications for Riyadh. Saudi Arabia could not publicly endorse strikes on a group with which it was nominally trying to negotiate peace, but it also could not ignore that the Houthi Red Sea campaign was devastating global shipping, raising insurance costs, disrupting trade, and creating exactly the kind of regional instability that Saudi Vision 2030 most needed to avoid. The Yemen file demonstrates the fundamental limits of the Saudi-Iran diplomatic breakthrough. Saudi Arabia and Iran can reduce their direct confrontation. They cannot fully control the behavior of the armed groups they have historically supported. The Houthis have their own interests, their own leadership, and their own ideological commitments that extend beyond what Tehran directs. The Gaza war, which began in October 2023, tested the Saudi-Iran détente in a different way. Both countries condemned Israel's military campaign in Gaza. Both called for a ceasefire. Both invoked the Palestinian cause. This shared position created unusual rhetorical alignment between Riyadh and Tehran and temporarily narrowed the political distance between them. Saudi Arabia, which had been in talks with the United States about potential normalization with Israel as part of a broader deal involving security guarantees and a Palestinian state pathway, effectively suspended those negotiations after October 7th. Any public move toward Israel had become politically impossible for MBS, given the overwhelming public sentiment in Saudi Arabia and across the Arab world. This inadvertently strengthened the Saudi-Iran relationship. The two countries found themselves on the same side of the most emotionally charged issue in the Arab world, but the alignment was superficial. Iran's support for Hamas, for Hezbollah, for the Houthi attacks on Israeli-linked shipping, all served Iranian strategic interests in ways that were not simply about Palestinian rights. Saudi Arabia's position was driven by domestic political pressure and regional public opinion, not by ideological alignment with Iran's revolutionary agenda. When Israeli and then American strikes hit Iranian nuclear facilities in June 2025, Saudi Arabia condemned the attacks on Iranian sovereignty, while quietly ensuring that its territory and airspace were not used in the military operations. That calibrated position, critical of the strikes but not supportive of Iranian retaliation, illustrated exactly where the Saudi-Iran relationship stood. Warmer than at any point in decades, but not an alliance. The 12-day Israeli-Iranian war of June 2025 was the most severe test yet. Israel struck Iranian nuclear sites and military infrastructure in a coordinated campaign. The United States then joined with B-2 stealth bombers destroying the Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear facilities. Iran responded with ballistic missile attacks on American bases in Qatar and Israeli positions. The Gulf Cooperation Council, including Saudi Arabia, publicly condemned the strikes on Iranian territory. Saudi Arabia made clear it would not allow its airspace or territory to be used for military operations against Iran. MBS directly communicated to Washington that Riyadh opposed the military campaign. This was the most significant test of the Saudi-Iran relationship, and it revealed something important. The relationship had created real constraints on American military freedom of action in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia's refusal to participate or facilitate the strikes was not simply diplomatic positioning. It was a direct consequence of the Beijing deal and the subsequent normalization process. Tehran noticed. The Gulf states' condemnation of the strikes was politically significant for Iran, providing it with regional legitimacy at its moment of maximum vulnerability. And Iran's response, calibrated to avoid triggering a full-scale war, reflected in part the reality that attacking Gulf states that had refused to participate in the strikes would be politically and strategically counterproductive. By late 2025 and into 2026, the Saudi-Iran relationship entered what analysts described as a managed rivalry rather than either a full reconciliation or return to open hostility. In December 2025, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and China held their third trilateral committee meeting in Tehran, reviewing implementation of the Beijing Agreement and reaffirming commitments on sovereignty and good neighborliness. In late January 2026, as Iranian protests over economic collapse intensified and American military assets moved toward the region, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman held a direct phone call to discuss regional stability. MBS made clear that Saudi Arabia would not allow its territory or airspace to be used against Iran. This was a remarkable statement of the relationship's substance. Saudi Arabia was not going to help America strike Iran. That was unthinkable, even 3 years earlier. But the relationship also had clear limits. Saudi Arabia was not going to defend Iran. It was not going to break its security partnership with the United States. It was not going to abandon its opposition to Iranian proxy influence in Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon. The détente had created a floor below which the relationship would not fall. It had not created a ceiling above which it could not rise. The power struggle had not ended. It had been managed. The question that now hangs over the Middle East is whether managed rivalry is sustainable. 3 pressures threaten to collapse it. The first is the nuclear question. Iran's nuclear facilities were severely damaged in the June 2025 strikes. But Iran retains its nuclear knowledge, its scientists, and its strategic motivation to develop a deterrent. If Tehran rebuilds its nuclear program and approaches weapons capability again, the pressure on Saudi Arabia to either seek its own nuclear capability or return to an adversarial posture toward Iran will become overwhelming. Saudi Arabia has already signaled interest in civilian nuclear power, and American discussions about a potential civil nuclear agreement with Riyadh raised the question of enrichment rights directly. A nuclear-armed or near-nuclear Iran, in a region where Saudi Arabia also pursues nuclear capabilities, is a recipe for the most dangerous arms race since the Cold War. The diplomatic breakthrough cannot survive that scenario. The second pressure is domestic politics in both countries. In Iran, the regime faces its most serious internal challenge since the 1979 revolution. The protests of late 2025 and early 2026, suppressed with extraordinary violence, reflect a population that has lost confidence in the Islamic Republic's ability to deliver economic security or political dignity. A regime fighting for survival at home may have less capacity for the kind of careful, calibrated diplomacy that the Saudi relationship requires. Domestic pressures may push Iranian hardliners to reassert the regime's revolutionary credentials through confrontational regional behavior, exactly the behavior the détente was designed to suppress. In Saudi Arabia, MBS has successfully consolidated power to a degree that allows him to make bold diplomatic moves that previous Saudi kings could not. But Vision 2030's success is not guaranteed, and if economic frustrations grow among Saudi citizens, the political calculus around the Iran relationship could shift. The third pressure is the United States. Washington, under the Trump administration, has pursued a maximum pressure strategy on Iran, while simultaneously maintaining its security partnership with Saudi Arabia. These two objectives pull in different directions. The more America pressures Iran, the more Tehran needs its Gulf relationships as a buffer. But the more Saudi Arabia accommodates Iranian interests, the more uncomfortable Washington becomes with its Gulf partners. Saudi Arabia has managed this tension skillfully by maintaining both relationships simultaneously. But if the pressure becomes acute enough, if America demands that Saudi Arabia choose sides in a direct military confrontation with Iran, the managed rivalry could collapse in either direction. The diplomatic breakthrough between Saudi Arabia and Iran was real. It was not theater. It ended a period of open confrontation that had produced the Abqaiq attack, the Yemen war, and hundreds of proxy engagements across the region. It created military-to-military communication channels, economic ties, diplomatic engagement, and political constraints on escalation that had not existed before. It demonstrated that China had become a serious diplomatic player in the Middle East, and that the region's major powers had agency to shape their own relationships independent of Washington. But it did not end the Middle East power struggle. It could not end it because the underlying conditions that generate that struggle remain unchanged. Saudi Arabia and Iran represent fundamentally different visions of regional order. Their competition for influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen continues. Their support for different factions, different political movements, different religious interpretations creates friction that no single diplomatic agreement can eliminate. What the breakthrough achieved was to lower the temperature of that competition enough to allow both countries to pursue their core interests, Vision 2030 for Riyadh, economic survival, and regional influence for Tehran, without destroying each other in the process. Whether that is enough, whether a managed power struggle can remain managed under the pressures now bearing down on it, is the defining question of the Middle East for the years ahead. The answer will determine whether the handshake in Beijing in March 2023 becomes the foundation of a new regional order, or merely an interlude between rounds of a conflict that neither side has truly decided to end.